Hi, I'm John Allen. I am the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news outlet. You can find us on the web at www.cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. I am also a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron. You can find all of their resources on the web at wordonfire.institute. That's wordonfire.institute. Welcome to another episode of the John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at the Word on Fire Institute. I'm broadcasting this week, as I have throughout the coronavirus quarantine, from my home in Rome, Italy, Caput Mundi, the crossroads of the Catholic world. Now, the last 2 weeks on the Vatican beat, as they always seem to be in the Pope Francis papacy, have been quite eventful. This week, we are going to break down for you three important recent developments. One, the Vatican's always interesting and always contentious relationship with China. There have been some steps there, and there have been criticism of those steps, as there always are, and we'll unpack all of that for you. Secondly, we have seen a sort of gradual return to normality in many parts of the world. A gradual, if you like, exit from the lockdown, the shutdown of the coronavirus period. Here in Italy, for instance, last Sunday, my wife and I were able to do a couple of things that most people in this country have not been able to do since the 8th of March, when the nationwide quarantine was imposed, which is we were able to go to Mass and we were able to go out to lunch. And aside from wearing masks in church and in the cab to and from the restaurant, other than that, it was a fairly normal experience. Aside from the fact that crowds at both places were much smaller than normal in church, because there are now caps as to how many people in an indoor space any given parish can admit. And that's true of the restaurant as well. Also, because there are still lots of people who are just fearful of a new spike in infection rates, especially the significant elderly population here in Italy. But nevertheless, there is a kind of sense of light at the end of the tunnel. Now, in many parts of the world, the question becomes, given the damage that has been done by the coronavirus, both the cost in terms of illness and death, but also, perhaps even more compellingly for society at large, the economic damage that has been done. How will places recover? And that is a question facing the Catholic Church as well. Now, connected to that is the question of what are the obstacles to recovery, to kind of mounting a creative response to an entirely new situation. Well, one of them is that the unified effort that any country, any institution, any church might want to mount to this crisis could be impaired by divisions that existed before this crisis and that have potentially been exacerbated by them. There are some early indications, at least here in Italy, there may be some danger of that. We will unpack all of that for you. Finally, there have been a couple of important milestones in the Catholic Church and here at the Vatican of late. One, we just recently marked the 5-year anniversary of Pope Francis's landmark encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on the care of creation, the care of our common home. The first ever papal encyclical entirely devoted to themes connected to ecology and the environment. The Vatican has announced a Laudato Si year, that is an entire year composed of events and publications and commemorations intended to shine a spotlight on the encyclical and its legacy. But you could make the argument, actually, that the legacy of Laudato Si doesn't necessarily need to be commemorated in any special way, because, in a sense, it provided the template for Pope Francis's response to the coronavirus as well. And perhaps even more broadly than that, a new relationship between the church and science. We will talk about that. Now, in addition, the church also recently marked the 100th anniversary of the birth of Saint Pope John Paul II. And of course, St. John Paul II was a towering figure who cut across absolutely every aspect of Catholic life for the more than 27 years of his papacy. We will talk about John Paul in the present and how his legacy is being evaluated today. All right, so that is the menu for this week's show. Those are the headlines. Stick around, and I'll supply you the context.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
All right, so we begin this week with the Vatican and China. The new development is that Civiltà Cattolica, that is a Jesuit Catholic civilization, that's a Jesuit-edited journal here in Rome, that enjoys a kind of semi-official status at the Vatican. That is, its issues are read by the Secretariat of State before publication and given approval. And so you can always assume that whatever is in Civiltà Cattolica and whatever Civiltà Cattolica is doing, in some broad sense, reflects the vision, the agenda, the desires of the Pope and his Vatican team. So Civiltà Cattolica, which is under the editorial direction of Italian Father Antonio Spadaro, who is, if not the closest advisor and ally of Pope Francis, certainly has a top spot in his inner circle. Civiltà Cattolica has launched a new edition in Chinese. It is a kind of simplified form of written Chinese, which is a form of Chinese that can be read easily by speakers of both Cantonese and Mandarin, the two major language families in China. This is an initiative that has long been in the works, although it is directly connected to a deal the Vatican signed with China in 2018 over the selection of bishops. Now, to this day, we don't actually know the details of that deal. It's called a provisional agreement. Because its terms have never been made public by either party, that is, either by China or by the Vatican. Critics will tell you that actually violates the 19th century Convention of Vienna that bans secret treaties among states. Defenders will tell you that a provisional agreement is not a treaty. And anyway, without getting bogged down in the technicalities, what I'm saying is that we have not actually seen the text of the agreement. What we know is that it concerns the selection of bishops, and that it gives China a significant role, in deciding who becomes a bishop in their country. Essentially, at least based on reports, what happens is that the Chinese will propose candidates, the Pope will then select the candidate, and the idea being to overcome a problem that has stretched over decades, where in some cases, a pope would appoint a bishop who was not recognized by the Chinese government, or the Chinese government would appoint a bishop who was not recognized by the Pope. In effect, you had two separate churches, one above ground and official, the other below ground, sort of a church of the catacombs. And this is part of a long effort to heal that breach. That reaches back, it did not start with Pope Francis. It reaches really all the way back to Pope Pius IX, who was the Pope during the communist takeover of China in 1949. And it's been a consistent policy of the Vatican ever since. And Father Spadaro said that the idea of launching this new edition of Civiltà Cattolica was inspired by that deal and the idea of trying to promote better understanding between the Vatican and Chinese culture. Now, this, as with everything when it comes to the church in China, this new edition of Civiltà Cattolica was really online only a few hours when it stirred controversy. In its sort of debut maiden edition, it carried an essay that had been written a year before by Jesuit Father Federico Lombardi, who was the spokesman for Pope Benedict XVI, and before that was the longtime director of Vatican Radio. An essay by Lombardi in which he said that provisional agreement in 2018, if it is viewed with understanding and with patience by all sides, will produce many positive fruits for China and for the church in China. Now, a blogger priest in China who is kind of known as a voice of dissidents immediately took issue with that. He pointed out that at the very time that essay was being published by a semi-official Vatican outlet, the Chinese government was running around tearing crosses off of the facades of churches in some parts of the country. And his question was, are we supposed to have patience for that? Are we supposed to have understanding for that? Now, that essay was then fairly quickly taken down in an effort to sort of put out the fire, but in some ways, it was emblematic of what happens whenever the Vatican tries to take some step in the direction of rapprochement with China, because there are always going to be those who will object that China often doesn't seem willing to reciprocate. That is, that it has a decidedly mixed record when it comes to human rights generally. It has a specifically mixed record when it comes to religious freedom. And there are those who would argue that having made that deal with the Vatican in 2018, if anything, authorities, at least in some regions of China, have felt emboldened to be even more aggressive in cracking down on what those authorities would see as potential sources of religious dissent or religious opposition. So this new edition of Civiltà Cattolica has simply once again generated question marks in many people about why the Vatican seems to be willing to in some sense, bend over backwards to try to accommodate the Chinese in a way it doesn't do anyplace else. Now, related to that, there's been another source of heartburn for some people on that front, which is Hong Kong. Of course, the Chinese government is on the process of imposing a new national security law for Hong Kong that some critics have described as the end of the one nation, two systems philosophy with which the United Kingdom returned Hong Kong to China. And it has sparked, once again, a new round of protest in China, despite the fact that that country is still in the midst of a coronavirus-related quarantine. And it has bothered some people that Pope Francis, at least as of this recording, has not said anything about it. I mean, bear in mind, this is a pope who generally is not shy about wading into controversy. He will clearly denounce the dangers of global warming, and he was quite critical, for instance, of the United States government when it withdrew from the Paris Agreement to combat climate change and global warming. He will denounce policies that he considers to be hostile or insensitive to migrants. He will denounce the conflict of Syria and the failures of the international community to bring that conflict to an end. He will denounce poverty and what he considers to be the inequities of global free market capitalism. And yet he hasn't said a word of solidarity or support for the protesters in Hong Kong. And many observers, at least, would read that as not wanting to upset the apple cart with China. Now, really the question here is why? Why is it such a priority of the Vatican to move forward in its relationship with China, and why is it willing to sacrifice so much to get that done? And there, I think there are probably two or three long-term historical factors worth mentioning. One is simply the fact that China is one-fifth of humanity. And if the Vatican wants to be a voice of conscience on the global stage, it simply cannot ignore China. Second is history. The Vatican is keenly aware that when many ordinary Chinese think about the Catholic Church, they would associate it with the Chinese rights controversy. They would associate it with European colonialism, the Boxer Rebellion, the Opium Wars. And in other words, they would see it as a kind of foreign import. And therefore, the Vatican is probably extra sensitive to not say or do anything that would feed that script, and which produces a reluctance to criticize China that it certainly would not feel, for instance, for Italy or the European Union generally, or the United States, or virtually any place in Latin America, any place that is either a traditionally majority Catholic culture, or at least where the Catholic Church is well established, and there's not the same risk of blowback. And then I think a third factor is specific to this the dynamics. Well, of course, that was specific to China as well. But a third factor is that the Vatican believes that it has always believed traditionally that having formal diplomatic relations with a country is a key, not merely to being able to engage that country in terms of broad geopolitical policy, but also to regularizing and stabilizing the situation of the church in that country. Therefore, the Vatican puts an extraordinary premium on achieving diplomatic relations with China. It's one of the few countries in the world with which the Vatican still does not have full diplomatic relations. And based on all available evidence, there's very little they wouldn't do to accomplish it. So the bottom line here is that while it is always interesting to sit around and debate whether the Vatican zigs or zags on China, I think the Civiltà Cattolica development is yet another confirmation that the broad policy here of doing whatever the Vatican can to accommodate China, dialing down criticism, and avoiding conflict, that broad policy is not up for discussion. It is set in cement, and it is moving forward. All right, shifting gears. The coronavirus and the gradual, well, what the Italians would call the ripresa, the return to something approaching normality. Now, many institutions, countries, states, municipalities, corporations, nonprofit organizations, and also religious organizations, institutions of all stripes around the world, to varying degrees, have been hit hard by the coronavirus crisis. Many of them are struggling with significant revenue shortfalls. Many of them are struggling with loss of personnel. Many of them are struggling with how they can continue whatever business they are in while complying with the new normal of coronavirus and public health protocols. And further, if you are a church, if you're the Catholic Church, you are thinking not just about the practical side, which is that, we just lost 3 months of collection plate income. And at the Vatican, we lost 3 months of ticket sales at the museums. The international markets are down, therefore our investments are going to make less. How do we, how do we fund our pension obligations? How do we cover payroll? I mean, those are all practical things that have to be considered. But you were also thinking about the emotional, the psychological, and more profoundly, the spiritual toll of this crisis. How do we gear up now that we can, once again, to in person, one-to-one, console all those people around the world who lost someone amid this crisis? How do we gear up to teach our kids who are scared now because they have been told for 3 months, don't go outside, don't touch your friends, don't touch strangers, don't venture outside of the house because there's something really dangerous out there. How do we, how do we gear up to help them readjust to overcome whatever trauma they may have experienced, and going forward to be prudent but not fearful, right? I mean, these are all real challenges, and we could keep going. But the point is, the church finds itself in a situation, like every other institution, where it's in a completely new situation. Unlike many other institutions, it bears responsibility not merely for the financial, logistical, operational difficulties, but also the emotional, psychological, and spiritual difficulties created by these quarantines and by this pandemic. Now, in general, responding effectively to new challenges, generally speaking, requires any institution to be able to break out of pre existing patterns, to be creative, to summon the best version of itself. The question is, will the Catholic Church be able to do that, or will divisions and fractures that existed prior to the coronavirus get in the way of such a unified and creative response? Obviously, we don't yet know. But there has been one recent storyline in Italy that is perhaps indicative in that regard. There is a priest in Sicily, Father Lorenzo Ricotta, who recently resigned as the pastor of a parish there because he said he simply could not abide by the new protocols for distribution of communion decreed by the Archbishop of Palermo, Archbishop Corrado Lorefice. Now, Archbishop Lorefice wasn't freelancing here. He simply issued in Palermo the same protocols, essentially, that have been issued by all the Italian bishops. And what they call for is for a priest to wear a mask during the celebration of the Mass, and especially during the distribution of communion. And prior to the distribution of communion, he is supposed to put on gloves, and then whether communicants approach him in a single file line, observing social distancing, or whether he comes to them in their places in the pews, those communicants are supposed to receive communion exclusively on the hand, and then he is supposed to return to the altar, remove his gloves, purify the vessels, and so on. Now, Father Ricotta objected to the idea of wearing gloves because he said that particles of the Eucharist could attach to those gloves, which then had to be recycled, which in his mind was tantamount to putting Jesus in the recycling bin. And he called it a sacrilege, an outrage, and basically said, I refuse to do it. He was then contacted, apparently, by Archbishop Lorefice, and he submitted his resignation to the Archbishop, not as a priest, but as the pastor of this church. Now, this has overtones of the broader, if you like, sort of wars of culture in the church under Pope Francis, because Father Ricotta is a well-known, sort of traditionally minded, staunch conservative in Italian Catholicism. Just days before his act of defiance over communion, he had posted one of his homilies to YouTube, in which he denounced what he described as the heresies, apostasies, and false ecumenism of the contemporary church, among other things, calling the growth of the ecumenical movement in Catholicism since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s a catastrophe. Archbishop Corrado Lorefice, on the other hand, is a classic, sort of moderate to progressive Pope Francis bishop. He did his doctoral work on Cardinal Giacomo Leccato of Bologna, who was one of the progressive heroes of the Second Vatican Council, and also Father Giuseppe Dossetti, one of the heroes of Italian resistance to fascism and then the construction of democracy in the post-war era. He is a great admirer of the anti-mafia priest, Father Pino Pugliese, who was gunned down by assassins in 1983, known for his option for the poor in Sicily. And so In that sense, this isn't just a dispute over the distribution of communion. It is a clash between two very different worldviews. Now, the thing of it is, each of those worldviews, arguably anyway, has a right of citizenship in the Catholic Church. As Catholics, we believe that tradition is important. We believe the liturgy is important. We are, by nature and in a sense by DNA, conservatives in that our primary charge is to preserve intact the deposit of faith. On the other hand, as Catholics, we also believe in the defense of the poor. We believe in continuity, but also reform and renewal. We believe in a creative response to new circumstances. We believe in faith and reason, and always bringing the best of our reason to bear, drawing upon the faith, but responding to the new circumstances before which we find ourselves. And so one could say, well, the ideal here would be that churchmen such as Lorefice and Ricotta would find ways in which they could each draw upon the best of their perspectives, their instincts, their biographies, and try to help one another respond creatively to the challenges of the post-coronavirus period rather than coming to loggerheads. Now, maybe that's a naive pipe dream. We will see. Only time will tell, obviously. It is too early to assess. But this one isolated instance, in any event, is sort of a canary in the coal mine, I think, alerting us that if we are not careful, the kind of creative response the church needs to this situation might well get bogged down in divisions that obviously significantly predate the coronavirus pandemic. All right. Finally, milestones. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this is the 5-year anniversary of Laudato Si, the first ever papal encyclical devoted entirely to the environment. The Vatican has put together a schedule for the next year of various ways to commemorate it. However, looked at from another point of view, it really doesn't need any special commemoration because the truth of it is, we have seen the legacy of Laudato Si in action, alive and well, over the last 3 months in Rome and in many other parts of the Catholic world. After all, what was the premise of Laudato Si? The premise of Laudato Si was that there is a strong scientific consensus in favor of a man, if not man-made, at least heavily man-influenced warming of the planet with alarming environmental consequences. And that scientific consensus has to be taken seriously by the church as both a policy challenge and also a moral and evangelical challenge. In other words, it was premised on taking science seriously. Now, what was the blueprint for the coronavirus? The church in most parts of the world, including in the Vatican, in Italy, in the United States, essentially voluntarily suspended what Vatican II called the source and summit of Christian life, which is the Mass, or at least obviously public celebration of the Mass. The Church voluntarily suspended public celebration of the Mass and the other sacraments based upon taking a scientific consensus seriously. That is, that this is what public health experts, epidemiologists, scientists, researchers, this is what they were telling us was necessary in order to combat transmission of this infection and therefore break the back, if you like, flatten the curve of this pandemic. And it happened almost, well, not unquestioningly because there was vigorous debate, but at the leadership level, it happened almost uniformly and almost instinctively. And I don't think that is exclusively because of Laudato Si. I think it is because of something that has been happening, unfolding over perhaps the last century and a half, which is a kind of rapprochement, a healing of what was perceived as a long rupture between religion and science. The raw truth of it is, and you see this both in Laudato Si and in the coronavirus, today, the Catholic Church is, in effect, the chaplain of whatever today's scientific consensus is. We are, and we have become, the greatest supporters, and we have become certainly the greatest spiritual spokespeople for the findings and the counsel of science today. That, historically speaking, is a remarkable thing. Now, we can debate the wisdom, obviously, of the measures bishops' conferences around the world or the Vatican itself took, but I think it is worth pausing for a moment. Given the history here, all the water under the bridge in the relationship between the Catholic Church and organized religion generally and science, and noting the remarkable fact that in both of these instances, that is, the press for action against climate change and also action against the coronavirus, the scientific community and the Catholic Church were, in essence, in complete lockstep. I think that is something worth pondering. And finally, of course, we have seen the 100th anniversary of the birth of a figure that many people already, in advance of an official declaration, are calling John Paul the Great. That is Karol Wojtyła of Poland, who went on to become a priest and later the Archbishop of Krakow, a cardinal, and eventually, of course, the sovereign pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church for almost 27 years, from 1978 to 2005. Now, for those of us who lived through John Paul's papacy, who saw him in action, he's just unforgettable. And it is impossible not to feel that the church, when he died in April 2005, that the church lost a giant. But of course, we are now 15 years away from that moment. There is a new generation on the Catholic scene that really doesn't have much living memory of John Paul II, for whom he has become a historical figure akin to, say, Pope Leo XIII or, Pope Pius XII, and who evaluate him differently. And the question today is being asked, given the way that the clerical sexual abuse scandals in Catholicism have metastasized since the death of John Paul, does that provide a new lens through which John Paul's legacy should be seen? And for that matter, does it call into question the whole idea of beatifying and canonizing popes before a proper historical distance has passed to be able to evaluate their legacy objectively? Now, that debate certainly was revived by the 100th anniversary. I had an opportunity to speak to the rector at the University of St. Thomas Aquinas here in Rome, popularly known as the Angelicum, Father Polash, who has recently launched a new program on John Paul II and culture. And I asked him that question. And his answer was, look, these questions need answers. There needs to be a thorough, objective study of all of the cases of clerical sexual abuse that arose during the John Paul years, how they were handled, where, if there were failures, where culpability lies, and so on. But at the end of the day, he is absolutely confident that although that may be a tarnish on John Paul's legacy, ultimately it does not call into question either his mammoth accomplishments or his personal sanctity. And that may not yet quite be a settled consensus, but I suspect that's what most people have been thinking and feeling around this milestone. That is, that we are not here dealing with an either or, but a both and. And the both and is, there may have been incredible omissions, failures, short-sightedness during the John Paul years, some of which may have been committed by the Pope himself. He was, after all, a Polish bishop who had grown up under National Socialism and came of age under the Soviet occupation of Poland. When outside parties would come in trying to tear the church apart, he had a certain approach to that formed by his own experience that maybe didn't lend itself particularly well to responding to the challenges of the clerical abuse crisis. And all of that has to be examined and documented honestly. And if it wasn't done in a completely thorough fashion during his sainthood cause, it still has to be done now. On the other hand, does that call into question his sainthood? Look, the Vatican has always said that canonizing a pope is not the same thing as canonizing his pontificate. It means that despite whatever human failures of judgment or prudence or governance he may have committed while he was in charge, nevertheless, he was an example of heroic virtue who struggled to live a life of personal sanctity. And my own sense would be that 100 years from the birth of John Paul II and 15 years from his death, the case for his heroic virtue and the case for his sanctity is more or less by this stage beyond all doubt. All right, that's the John Allen Show for this week. Thanks for being with us. We will join you again in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay safe, enjoy your represa wherever you may be. Keep checking out Crux at cruxnow.com. Keep checking out the Word on Fire Institute at wordonfire.institute. And until we speak again, have a fantastic and blessed fortnight.